Hello, my name is Nick Deborah. I'm an independent instructor and author in the fields of data visualization and dashboard design. And in this short video, I wanted to do kind of a chart makeover. The chart that we're looking at right now is one that came up recently. I saw it on LinkedIn. It's from a publication that I hadn't heard of. It's called the European Correspondent, which seems to do good work. And it's not a bad chart, but it did prompt a lot of discussion. And I ended up actually sort of seeing some ways maybe in which it could be improved. And so I made those improvements and they ended up looking like this. And so in this short video, I wanted to kind of step through what was my decision-making process behind all of these design changes. And then you can let me know if you agree or disagree with some of these changes that I made. So coming back to our original chart here, what exactly are we looking at here? It's basically a chart of the ages at which women in different European countries give birth to their first child. And we can see that, for example, Italy here has mothers that are relatively older than the mean, which is specified up here, the European average of 28.8 years. And that Azerbaijan down here has mothers who are relatively younger than the average age for all European mothers in terms of delivering their first child. And so it's not a bad chart, but I did see some areas where I felt that it could be improved. For example, I felt that the zebra striping behind here was actually a little bit confusing because it kind of makes this chart look like a single table. And that, for example, Spain and Czechia here and Switzerland and Hungary are kind of in the same row of a table. But to me, that doesn't really work very well because this is not a single table. It's actually one long chart that's been kind of split into two separate charts, which is not the same thing as a single table. And it makes it look like, for example, Spain and Czechia are kind of part of the same thing, because that's what it means when we put two things in the same row of a table. It means they're part of the same thing. And for example, in your inbox, in an email client, you have the date, the name of the sender, the subject. These are all kind of part of the same thing, but really that connection doesn't really exist between these two charts. And the main message is just kind of unclear. It's okay, the age of motherhood and the age difference of first-time mothers to European average. Is there some kind of takeaway here? I'm not really sure. The meaning of the colors requires some thought, right? So green means that the age between 2014 and the present time, whatever that is, remained kind of stable for a given country, whereas blue means that it increased a lot. Seems like a kind of a strange color choice and also kind of strange categories, sort of stable versus increased a lot. I might have maybe used different colors, like maybe a stable sort of like a light blue and then increased a lot as being kind of a darker blue. So I felt that there's maybe some room for improvement there. The connection between, the quantitative scale here, which says mean, plus 2 years, mean -2, -4 years, it takes a bit of a leap, right? Because I have to sort of figure out, what does this mean? Oh, this refers actually to this, the European average of 28.8 years. I just felt that could maybe be a bit clearer. And the quantitative scale is a little bit unusual. Like the stops on here are mean -2 years, -4 years. I'll figure it out, but it's going to take a little bit of work. And then I have these callouts down here, and these refer to values from 2014, but the chart itself is only showing values from the most recent time. I assume it's probably 2023 or something like that. And so kind of hard to see these insights if I can't actually see the values from 2014. And so in order to make some improvements, I recreated this as best I could in Excel. It's not a perfect facsimile, close enough. And one of the things that people on LinkedIn suggested was, yes, in order to make the kind of separation clearer between these two charts, so they don't look like a single table, they actually look like kind of two more kind of separate charts, is to maybe add a gap. And yeah, that would accomplish it. But my response to that was like, okay, but now what is the zebra striping really even doing, right? Not much. And so I think we could potentially get rid of it because it just really wasn't serving a purpose that I could really sort of see at any rate. And now what we essentially end up with is a chart which looks like it actually contains two charts, right? There's a chart on the left, chart on the right. And when you look closely at the data, you realize that actually, yes, this is kind of two charts or two groups here. There are countries that have above average mother ages at the time of the first child and below average, right? The ones on the right are mothers who are kind of younger than the average. And so we could just add those as chart titles to make it clear sort of what is the difference between the values on the left and the values on the right. It's basically the same metric, but we're comparing to the dividing point is basically kind of the average. And I think there's also opportunities here to make our quantitative scale axes a little bit more descriptive, right? Just mean plus 2 years minus 4 years is, like, again, people figure it out. But if we did something like this, for example, and we actually specify what is the mean? Oh, it's the European mean, which is 28.8 years. Ah, okay. And then it's just 2 years older. It's a little bit more specific than just saying plus 2 years or minus 2 years. Instead, we put younger. Okay, so that's what that means, right? That minus 4 is a little bit easier to understand if you just say 4 years younger. And now this subtitle here, age difference of first-time mothers from European average 28.8 years, is actually kind of redundant because we've included that information directly in the chart itself. So we don't actually need it. We can actually get rid of that entirely now. And now, because of this heading of this chart here, right, countries with younger than average first-time mothers, I probably expect to see the sort of youngest countries listed first. But now it's not really the case, right? The youngest ones are down here. And so maybe I'll flip that. And so now I'm sorting from the countries who have the youngest first-time mothers to the ones that are basically very close to the European mean. This is kind of screwed up the placement of my callouts, though, because they were referring to countries like Slovakia and Turkey, but now they're pointing to the wrong countries, and so I'll just move those up here. And so now they're pointing to the correct countries. Now, it's still not really kind of clear, though, what is the overall message of this chart? What am I supposed to get from this? I see, okay, Turkey recorded the biggest change, Slovakia was the smallest change, but is there some sort of overall message that I'm supposed to get from this? If I go back to the article that this chart came from, it was part of an article in this publication. What it's talking about is essentially how the ages of first-time mothers in Europe have been increasing over time. But that's really not particularly obvious, not to me anyways, from this chart. I have to look at the colors here, but even there, I can't really see. It just says increased by at least 1 year, but increased by 2 years, 5 years, right? Not really sure. And so I think given that's the main insight, which is basically how this has changed since 2014, I think we kind of have to include the 2014 values in the chart. And yes, that is going to make our chart a little bit more complicated, but at least I can now see, oh yeah, there have been these significant increases in many cases from 2014 to the present, or sort of the most recent year. And at least I can actually see that kind of main insight. It's not explicitly stated in the chart, though, that this is the point of the chart. And so maybe I'll do that. I'll just put that as put that main message as a title, right? The increasing age of first-time mothers. Okay, now I'm getting an idea of what this chart is for. What am I supposed to get from this? And I could even maybe clarify it by adding a subtitle here. The average age of first-time mothers has increased in most European countries since 2014. Right, so that's just adding more precision to this main message. Now, if that's the main point of this chart, then these colors they don't make as much sense anymore, right? Because this is basically green for stable and blue for increase by 1 or more years. But really, if this is what I'm trying to say, then I probably want to distinguish between countries where the average age has increased versus decreased. And so maybe I'll assign my colors that way, right? And so orange is basically countries that have increased, and blue is countries that have decreased. And now when I look at my chart, I can see, yeah, it's mostly orange, right? So yes, indeed, most countries had increases in the average age of first-time mothers. There were a couple that decreased, but most were increasing. By the way, I had to actually make up the difference data between 2014 and 2023, whatever the most recent year was, because it wasn't actually included in the chart. So this is fake data, basically. Now, notice that there's quite a long sort of set of labels with my legend now, but I think that this is actually appropriate because oftentimes when our data is a little bit more complicated, this is the change and the average between 2 years compared to the average across all countries. Those are kind of complex metrics. And so I think it's warranted to actually use a lot of words to describe them so people understand what the numbers actually are in the chart. Now, again, if this is the main message, right, that the average age of first-time mothers has been increasing in all these countries, then I want to have a look at these quantitative scales, right? Because these are really focused on the mother's ages relative to the European average, right? Years above the average, years below the average. But the average for Europe isn't really even part of our main message. And so this kind of makes this quantitative scale a little bit complicated when it maybe doesn't have to be. If all we want to see is basically countries that had sort of younger mothers and older mothers, then we could just show the ages of the mothers, the average age when they deliver their first child. We don't really have to show it compared to the average for Europe. We could include that, we can include the average, but just put it a very secondary element here. And now this scale is actually quite a bit easier to read because I'm not showing deviations from the average. I'm just showing the raw numbers, right? What their average age actually is. And so I might be able to do something about these kind of subchart titles as well, because again, this title is sort of focused on comparison to the average, but that's not really what this chart is about. And so maybe we can simplify and just say these are the countries with the oldest first-time mothers, like Italy, Spain, Ireland, and these are the countries with the youngest first-time mothers, like Azerbaijan, Moldova, and Armenia. So the chart that we started with, it's not a bad chart, right? And it is kind of simpler looking than the version that I ended up with, but the main message isn't really very obvious. I would have to read the article that came with the chart in order to know what the main message is. And those important values, right, i.e. the values for 2014 just aren't shown, even though that seems to be really important with regards to what the main message of the chart actually is. And also with regards to these callouts as well, right? I have to see 2014 in order to see these actual insights. And the labeling is kind of a little bit less descriptive, and so it requires more deciphering on the part of the reader. The reader has to understand, oh yes, these are deviations from the European mean, right? So they can do it, it's just a little bit more work. And the color categories don't really support the main message, not in my opinion anyways, right? The color categories distinguish between sort of countries that were stable and countries that increased, whereas I think it would make more sense to distinguish between countries that increased and countries that decreased. And so what we end up with is something that at first glance is maybe a little bit more complex looking, but at least the main message is obvious. And so it's actually going to be less work for the reader, not more work. And those important values, in fact, those kind of essential values from 2014 are shown in the chart, right? And so the key insights are actually visible. I can actually see them in the chart. And we have more descriptive labeling, like those long legend names, for example, the headings above the two subcharts. That just makes interpretation easier, right? The user has to kind of put two and two together less, right? The chart does a lot of that work for them. And we have color categories that are more informative and better aligned with the overall message of the chart, in my opinion anyways, but certainly let me know what you think. If you want to know how did I come up with these improvements, or at least things that I consider to be improvements, I talk about a lot of these topics in my Practical Charts On Demand course, which is a brand new course that I've just started offering. 6.5 hours of pre-recorded video and 44 lessons, and includes my best-selling Practical Charts and more Practical Charts books. You can find out more about that on my website, practicalreporting.com, or pick up my books. Again, same website, practicalreporting.com. You'll find information about the courses and the books. Do let me know what you think in the comments. Are some of these actual improvements, or maybe did I make it worse in some way? Thanks for listening.